Bring him to me. King Darien's voice cut through the obsidian halls of Shadowmere, heaped like a blade forged in the deepest pits of hell, sending shivers down the spines of even his most battle-hardened warriors. The Alpha King sat upon his throne of blackened bone and carved shadowstone. Ancient and imposing at 273 years of age, his crimson eyes blazing with a fury that had been building for weeks. His scent, smoke and embers, old blood and colder rage, filled the throne room like a coming storm, making lesser vampires press themselves against the walls in instinctive submission. His guards fell to their knees immediately, the sound of their armor striking the marble floor echoing through the vast hall. "Yes, Your Majesty. I don't care what condition he's in," Darien continued, his claws gouging deep furrows into the armrests of his throne. Black stone crumbled beneath his grip, dust sifting down onto the dais like dark snow. The human Omega who dared to trespass into our territories, who somehow crossed our borders undetected, who has made a mockery of my entire kingdom. Bring him to me. Now. His voice thundered through the chamber, ancient and terrible, carrying the weight of centuries. The torches along the walls flickered in response to his rage, their flames guttering low before surging back to life. It had been 3 weeks since the first reports came in. An Omega, unbonded, alone, clearly human, wandering through the cursed forests that bordered the vampire territories. Darien's scouts had been tracking him, observing him, waiting for orders. The Alpha had been content to let the fear sink deep into the Omega's bones before dealing with him personally. Omegas didn't simply wander into vampire lands. They were sent as offerings, as sacrifices from human kingdoms that still foolishly believed they could appease the immortal lords with pretty, trembling bodies. The thought made Darien's lip curl with contempt. He'd seen it before. Human villages sending their unwanted Omegas into the Shadowlands as tribute, hoping to buy another year of peace from the monsters in the dark. Sometimes the Omegas came willingly, sacrificing themselves for their families. Sometimes they were dragged here in chains, screaming and pleading. Darien had never cared either way. They were food, nothing more. Entertainment for his court until their blood ran dry. But this Omega was different. Darien could feel it in his bones, in the ancient instinct that had been dormant for over 2 centuries. Something about this one called to him, pulled at him in ways he didn't understand and refused to examine too closely. Whatever his purpose, the Omega would answer for it. Captain Merrick, Darien's most trusted guard and a vampire who had served him for over 100 years, hesitated at the doorway. His scarred face was troubled, his amber eyes uncertain. "Your Majesty, perhaps we should consider. Are you questioning my orders, Captain?" "No, sire. Never." Merrick bowed lower, his dark hair falling across his face. "We'll retrieve him immediately. It's just, the Omega is in poor condition. The rogues who found him first. I said I don't care what condition he's in." Darien's voice dropped to something colder than the grave. "Bring him to me." As the guards dispersed, their footsteps echoing down the long corridors, Darien returned to his throne. He tried to ignore the strange restlessness that had plagued him since he'd first scented the Omega's presence on the wind. A sweet, fragile thing that had somehow carried all the way to the castle, making his alpha instincts stir and growl with something that felt dangerously like interest. He told himself it was simple irritation at the breach in security. Nothing more. But deep in his chest, where his heart had long since stopped its mortal rhythm, something ancient had stirred. Something possessive and hungry that he'd thought long dead. They brought him in at midnight. Darien sat in his throne room, surrounded by his court. Ancient vampires who had walked the earth for millennia. Beautiful and terrible creatures who had long forgotten what it meant to feel anything beyond hunger and boredom. They gathered like crows on a battlefield, eager to see the Omega who had caused such disruption in their king's carefully ordered existence. Their eyes glittered with anticipation, their fangs lengthening slightly at the thought of fresh blood. The massive doors groaned open, their iron hinges screaming in protest. "The prisoner, Your Majesty," Captain Merrick announced, his voice echoing through the sudden silence. Two guards entered, dragging something between them. "No, someone." Darien leaned forward, his eyes narrowing, his fingers gripping the armrests of his throne so tightly that the shadow stone groaned in protest. The Omega's feet scraped against the marble floor as they hauled him toward the throne. His head hung low, dark hair matted and tangled, falling across his face like a shroud. His clothes were torn, hanging in shreds from his thin frame, revealing skin that was mottled with bruises of every color, purple and black and sickly yellow-green. Through the tattered fabric, Darien could see the evidence of systematic abuse. Finger-shaped bruises wrapped around his upper arms where someone had held him down. Cuts and gashes crisscrossed his chest, some still oozing blood. His wrists were raw and bloody from restraints. "Closer," Darien commanded, his voice cold as winter's grave. They dragged the Omega to the base of the dais and threw him down. He collapsed onto the hard floor with a sound that made something in Darien's chest tighten uncomfortably. A small, pained gasp that was immediately stifled. The Omega's body curled in on itself instinctively, protecting his most vulnerable areas, and Darien recognized the pose with a flash of cold fury. That was the posture of someone who had learned the hard way that showing weakness invited more pain. "Look at me," Darien ordered. The Omega didn't move. His shoulders trembled slightly, whether from cold or fear or exhaustion, Darien couldn't tell. "I said look at me, Omega." Slowly, painfully, the prisoner lifted his head, and Darien forgot how to breathe. Even vampires who didn't need air knew the sensation of breath catching in their throats. Darien felt it now, a phantom memory of humanity that slammed into him with unexpected force, making his dead heart lurch in his chest. The Omega's face was a canvas of brutality. A deep purple bruise bloomed across his left cheek, swelling his eye nearly shut. His bottom lip was split and crusted with dried blood, the cut so deep that Darien could see the raw tissue beneath. More bruises decorated his neck, his arms, every inch of exposed skin. Someone had beaten him systematically and thoroughly, taking their time, making sure he felt every blow. But it was his eyes that destroyed Darien. They were the color of winter frost, pale silver blue with flecks of deeper gray, like a frozen lake just before dawn. And they looked at him with neither fear nor pleading, just exhaustion, the kind of bone-deep weariness that came from someone who had already lost everything and had nothing left to beg for. Someone who had accepted death as an old friend, long overdue for a visit. He was the most beautiful thing Darien had ever seen, and someone had dared to hurt him. The rage that consumed Darien was unlike anything he'd experienced in his long, blood-soaked existence. It wasn't the cold, calculated anger he usually wielded like a weapon, the controlled fury that made his enemies tremble. This was primal, burning, absolute. His alpha instincts roared to life with a force that nearly drove him to his knees, screaming at him to protect, to destroy, to claim, to find every creature who had laid hands on this Omega and tear them apart with his bare hands. The temperature in the throne room dropped so rapidly that frost began spreading across the windows in delicate, crystalline patterns. The torches along the walls flickered wildly, their flames guttering and dying one by one, plunging the room into near darkness. The vampires of his court scrambled backward, their own instincts screaming at them to flee from their king's unleashed fury. Who did this? Darien's voice was barely a whisper, but it carried to every corner of the vast hall, echoing off the shadowstone walls like the voice of death itself. The guards shifted nervously, exchanging glances. Captain Merrick stepped forward, his scarred face pale. "Your Majesty, we found him in this condition. He had already been." "Who did this?" The Omega flinched at his roar, the first real sign of fear he'd shown. His battered body curled tighter, and Darien forced himself to pull back the rage, to remember himself. But the monster inside him, The ancient alpha predator that had slaughtered thousands, wanted blood, wanted vengeance, wanted to make the world burn for daring to harm what was his. What was his? The thought stopped Darien cold. When had he started thinking of the Omega as his? He didn't even know his name. But the bond, the ancient, legendary bond that he dismissed as nothing more than fairy tales told to lonely vampires, had already snapped into place, settling around his heart like chains of fire. "Answer me, Captain." Merrick swallowed hard, his throat working visibly. "When we found him in the Shadowlands, he was being detained by a group of lesser vampires. Rogues from the southern territories. They were." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "Amusing themselves with him, before they planned to drain him. And where are these rogues now?" "We have them in the dungeons, Your Majesty. We thought you might want to question them about why they brought an Omega into your lands." Darien rose from his throne, descending the dais steps with inhuman grace. His court parted before him like a dark sea, none daring to meet his eyes. He approached the Omega, who remained on his knees, swaying slightly. This close, Darien could see the trembling in his limbs, the way he struggled to keep himself upright. Could see the blood that still seeped from a wound on his side, soaking through his ruined shirt. He could also smell his scent. It hit Darien like a physical blow, driving the air from his lungs. Beneath the copper tang of blood and the sharp edge of fear, there was something else. Something that called to him on a level he didn't understand. The Omega's natural scent was muted by pain and exhaustion, but what Darien could detect was intoxicating. Winter roses, frost-covered pine, something wild and untamed that made his alpha instincts howl with recognition and hunger. The scent of a fated mate. Darien's mind rebelled against the knowledge. It wasn't possible. Alpha vampires didn't have fated mates. That was a myth, a legend told to hopeful young vampires who hadn't yet learned that love was a weakness and fate was a lie. He'd lived for over 2 centuries without ever feeling even a fraction of this connection. He'd taken lovers, both human and vampire, but never felt anything more than passing interest. Never felt this burning, consuming need. It had to be a mistake. Some trick or enchantment. A trap set by his enemies, using this broken Omega as bait. But as he looked into those frost-blue eyes, seeing the glimmer of something that might have been recognition staring back at him, Darien knew with absolute certainty that everything in his long existence had led to this moment. Every battle he'd fought, every kingdom he'd conquered, every life he'd taken, it had all been preparation for this. And someone had dared to brutalize what was his. "What is your name?" Darien asked, his voice gentler than he'd intended. The question surprised him almost as much as it seemed to surprise the Omega. The Omega looked up at him again, those frost-blue eyes meeting Darien's crimson ones. When he spoke, his voice was rough, probably from screaming. "Kale." Darien repeated it, tasting the name on his tongue. "Kale. Who sent you here?" A bitter smile crossed his split lip, making him wince. "No one sent me. I came looking for death. I suppose I found it." The words struck Darien oddly. There was no deception in his face, no hint of the cunning spy or willing sacrifice. Just honest, devastating truth. This Omega had wanted to die, and Darien's rogues had been more than happy to oblige. Why? The question escaped before Darien could stop it. Kale swayed again, and Darien moved on instinct, catching him before he collapsed. The moment his hands touched the Omega's arms, something electric passed between them, a jolt of recognition that made them both gasp. Darien could feel it through the contact, the bond singing between them like a plucked harp string. Kale's skin was cold, too cold for a living Omega. His heartbeat was faint and irregular, fluttering like a wounded bird in his chest. And his scent, Darien could smell it properly now, and it was everything. Winter roses and frost-kissed pine, clean and sharp and utterly intoxicating. Underneath the pain and fear, there was something else. Something warm and sweet that made Darien's alpha instincts purr with satisfaction. Their eyes locked, and in that moment, Darien saw it. The thing he'd thought was legend. The bond that his kind whispered about in darkness, but never truly believed in. The mate bond. This broken, battered Omega was his fated mate. No, it wasn't possible. Alpha Kings didn't have fated mates. Darien had lived for over 200 years without ever feeling even a fraction of this connection. It had to be a mistake, some trick or enchantment. But as he held Kale in his arms, feeling the faint flutter of his heartbeat against his chest, Darien knew with absolute certainty that everything in his long existence had led to this moment. And someone had dared to brutalize what was his. "Captain Merrick," he said, his voice deadly calm. "Yes, Your Majesty." "The rogues in the dungeon. I want them brought to the courtyard. Stake them out for the sunrise." A collective gasp went through the court. Death by sunlight was the most agonizing end a vampire could face, reserved only for the most heinous crimes. The rogues would feel every moment of their skin burning, their bodies turning to ash, their screams echoing through the courtyard until there was nothing left but dust. "Consider it done, sire." Darien looked down at the Omega in his arms. At Kale. He had lost consciousness, his body finally giving up its fight. Darien could feel how fragile he was, how close to the edge of death. Fury and protectiveness warred within him, a storm of emotion that threatened to overwhelm his carefully maintained control. "Clear the throne room," he commanded. "Everyone out. Now." His court scrambled to obey, centuries of loyalty and fear driving them from the hall in seconds. Even Captain Merrick retreated, though his expression showed confusion at his king's unprecedented behavior. He'd never seen Darien act like this, and the confusion was plain on his scarred face. When they were alone, Darien carefully lifted Kale into his arms properly. The Omega weighed almost nothing, and Darien could feel every one of his bones through his ruined clothing. How long had he been suffering? How long had those rogues had their hands on him before Darien's guards found him? The thought made his blood boil, made the monster inside him howl for vengeance. He carried Kale through the winding corridors of Shadowmere Keep, past tapestries depicting ancient battles and conquests, past windows that showed the eternal night of his kingdom. Servants pressed themselves against walls as he passed, their eyes wide at the sight of their Alpha King, carrying an Omega so tenderly. Darien ignored them all, his focus entirely on the fragile weight in his arms. He brought Kale to his private chambers, rooms that no one else was permitted to enter, not even his most trusted advisors. The massive bed was draped in black silk, and Darien laid him down gently, as if he were made of glass, as if he might shatter at the slightest touch. In the candlelight, Kale's injuries looked even worse. The bruises were turning darker, spreading across his skin like storm clouds. Darien could see the trembling that shook his frame, the way his breath came in shallow, uneven gasps. Shock, probably. Blood loss. Who knew what other damage had been done to him, what internal injuries those rogues had inflicted? Darien had healers, the best in all the immortal kingdoms. But as he looked at Kale's pale face, at the slow, shallow rise and fall of his chest, he knew that traditional healing might not be enough. The Omega was slipping away, his life force flickering like a candle in a hurricane. There was another way, a way that both terrified and thrilled him. His blood could heal Kale. Vampire blood had powerful regenerative properties for humans. It could cure almost any wound, any illness. But it also created a connection, a bond that would tie Kale to him. If he was truly Darien's mate, giving him his blood would complete the first stage of the bond. It would also mean Kale could never truly leave him. The ethical implications should have given Darien pause. Kale hadn't consented, didn't even know what Darien was considering. But as he watched the Omega's life force flickering, growing weaker by the moment, Darien found he didn't care about ethics or propriety. He couldn't let Kale die. Not when he just found him. Not when the bond was singing between them, begging him to save his mate. Making his decision, Darien bit into his wrist, tearing open the vein. Dark blood welled up, thick and rich. and he pressed it to Kale's lips. "Drink, Kale," he whispered. "Live." Kale woke to the absence of pain. After weeks of constant agony, the sudden lack of it was so disorienting that he lay perfectly still, afraid to move. Afraid the suffering would come crashing back. His eyes remained closed as he took inventory of his body, waiting for the familiar ache of broken bones and torn flesh. But there was nothing. The ribs that had been cracked were whole. The cuts and bruises that had covered his skin were gone. Even the persistent ache in his jaw from where one of the vampires had struck him had vanished, replaced by a strange warmth that seemed to radiate from his chest. What was happening? Slowly, he opened his eyes. A canopy of black silk stretched above him, and beyond it a ceiling painted with stars. Not painted, Kale realized with a start, but enchanted. The stars moved slowly across the ceiling, tracing ancient constellations he didn't recognize. The room around him was vast and luxurious, filled with furniture that must have cost more than his entire village had been worth. Dark wood, rich fabrics, candles that burned with a soft, steady light. Not his ceiling. He'd been sleeping on cold ground for months. Not the dank cell where the rogues had kept him. This was somewhere else entirely. He turned his head and immediately froze. The Alpha King sat in a chair beside the bed, watching him with those unsettling crimson eyes. He looked different from the night before. Less angry, more human. Though that seemed the wrong word for what he was. His dark hair fell across his forehead, and in the soft candlelight, his pale skin seemed to glow. His features were sharp and aristocratic, the kind of beauty that seemed almost too perfect to be real. He was, Kale realized with a jolt, the most beautiful creature he'd ever seen. "You're awake," the Alpha said, his voice lacking the thunder it had held in the throne room. "How do you feel?" Kale pushed himself up to sitting, surprised when his body obeyed without protest. He looked down at his arms. Smooth, unblemished skin met his eyes. No bruises, no cuts. Even the scar he'd had on his wrist from a childhood accident was gone, the skin perfectly healed. "What did you do to me?" The fear crept into his voice despite his best efforts. He'd seen what vampires could do to humans. He'd experienced it firsthand. "I healed you." Darian leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "You were dying. I gave you my blood." Horror flooded through Kale. He'd heard the stories. Vampire blood was powerful, dangerous, addictive. It could heal, but it came with a price. It created a bond, tied the human to the vampire who had shared their blood. He'd heard of humans who became little more than thralls, their wills subsumed by their vampire masters. "What does that mean? What have you done?" "It means you'll live." The Alpha's expression was unreadable. "And it means we need to talk." Kale scrambled back on the bed, suddenly aware of how alone they were. How trapped he was in this room with a predator who could kill him before he could even scream. His heart hammered in his chest, and he could feel the old familiar panic rising. The same panic he'd felt when the rogues had surrounded him in that dark forest. "You're going to drain me. That's why you healed me. You want me healthy before you. I'm not going to hurt you." Darian interrupted, his voice sharp. Then softer. "I'm not going to hurt you, Kale." The way he said Kale's name sent shivers down his spine. There was something intimate in it. Possessive. Kale didn't like it. He didn't like any of this. "Then what do you want from me?" Darian stood, and Kale tensed. But the Alpha only moved to the window, gazing out at the perpetual night of his kingdom. The landscape beyond was beautiful in a terrible way. Dark forests, distant mountains, a sky full of stars that never faded. "First, I want the truth. Why did you come to the Shadowlands?" No Omega stumbles into vampire territory by accident. Kale pulled the silk sheet around himself, a flimsy shield against vulnerability. He had nothing left to lose. Death had been his goal anyway. The truth wouldn't cost him anything. "I came to find the night market," he said quietly. Darian turned sharply. "The night market is a myth humans tell each other." "No, it's not. It's real, and it's held once a year in the Shadowlands." I spent 6 months following rumors and bribing border guards to find out when and where. He met Darian's gaze steadily. I came to buy something. Buy what? A life for a life. Kale's voice cracked despite his efforts to keep it steady. My little brother is dying. He has the wasting sickness. The healers in our kingdom say there's no cure, that he has weeks at most. But I heard that at the night market, you can trade anything for anything. A life for a life. I came to offer myself in exchange for his healing. Darian stared at him for a long moment, his expression unreadable. You came here to sacrifice yourself for your brother. Yes, sire. And the rogues found you first. Kale's hands tightened on the sheet as the memories flooded back. The laughter as they'd surrounded him. The pain. The violation of being prey for creatures who saw him as nothing but entertainment and food. He pushed the memories down, burying them deep. He couldn't afford to break down now, not when he'd survived so much. Yes, he whispered. Something dangerous flickered across Darian's face. How long did they have you? I don't know. Days. A week. Time stopped meaning anything. He looked up at Darian. Your guards saved me, didn't they? Before they could finish, Captain Merrick and his men interrupted their sport. Yes. Darian's voice was cold again, that barely contained rage simmering beneath the surface. They brought you to me. To execute me for trespassing. That was my intention. And now? Kale asked. What's changed? You healed me, but I'm still an Omega who illegally entered your kingdom. I assume that's still punishable by death. Darian moved back to the chair, sitting down heavily. He looked at Kale with an expression Kale couldn't quite read, something between wonder and frustration. Everything has changed, Kale, and you're at the center of it. I don't understand. No, Darian said softly. You wouldn't. Tell me, do you feel anything unusual? Any strange sensations since you woke? Kale frowned, taking stock again. Now that he mentioned it, there was something. A warmth in his chest that hadn't been there before. A pull toward the alpha that felt almost magnetic. Kale had attributed it to fear or gratitude, but it was more than that. It was as if a string was tied between them, connecting his heart to Darian's. He could feel it tugging gently, urging him closer. I feel something, he admitted reluctantly. But I don't know what it is. Darian nodded, as if he'd expected that answer. My kind have a legend. Something most of us believe is nothing more than a fairy tale. We call it the mate bond. A connection between two souls that transcends death itself. It's said that even vampires who are technically dead can find their perfect match. When they do, the bond snaps into place, linking them forever. For alpha vampires, it's even rarer and more powerful. The bond with an Omega-fated mate is absolute. Dread pooled in Kale's stomach. Why are you telling me this? Because when I touched you last night, when I caught you before you fell, the bond snapped into place. Darian's crimson eyes bored into his. You, Kale, are my fated Omega. The words hung in the air between them like a death sentence. Kale stared at Darian, waiting for him to laugh, to say it was a joke. But the alpha's expression was deadly serious. No, Kale said, shaking his head. No. That's not possible. I'm human. You're a vampire alpha. This is some kind of trick. I wish it were. Darian's voice held genuine frustration. Do you think I wanted this? I've ruled for over 2 centuries without a mate, without any weakness. And then you appear, broken and bleeding, and suddenly everything I've built is at risk because the thought of anyone hurting you makes me want to burn the world down. That's not love. That's possession. I never said it was love. Darian's voice softened. The mate bond isn't about love, not at first. It's about recognition. Your soul knows mine, and mine knows yours. What we make of it, that's up to us. Kale shook his head, trying to process this. This couldn't be happening. He'd come here to die saving his brother, not to become some vampire alpha king's fated Omega. He'd accepted his death, made peace with it. But this was something else entirely. I don't want this. I don't want any of this. Neither do I, Darian admitted. But we don't have a choice. The bond is there whether we accept it or not. Then I'll leave. I'll go back to my kingdom. Forget all of this. And you can. You'll die within a week. The blunt words stopped Kale cold. What? Darian stood again, pacing now, agitated. His usual controlled demeanor had cracked, revealing the turmoil beneath. The bond, once formed, needs to be maintained. We don't have to complete it. That would require you to be turned, to become like me. But we do need proximity, especially in the beginning. If you leave now, the bond will try to pull you back. You'll sicken and waste away. And so will I. You're lying. You're trying to trap me here. Look inside yourself, Kale. Darian stopped in front of him, close enough that Kale could feel the cold radiating from his body. The bond doesn't lie. Try to imagine leaving this room. Going far from here. What does it feel like? Despite himself, Kale closed his eyes and tried to picture it. Walking out of the castle, traveling back through the Shadowlands, returning to his kingdom, to Finn. The thought should have filled him with relief, with hope. Instead, immediately, pain lanced through his chest, so sharp and sudden he gasped. The warm string connecting him to Darian felt like it was being pulled taut, ready to snap. His body rebelled at the very thought of distance, his Omega instincts screaming at him to stay close to his Alpha, to protect the bond at all costs. He opened his eyes to find Darian watching him with grim understanding. I hate you, Kale whispered. I know. They sat in silence for a long moment. Kale felt tears burning behind his eyes, but he refused to let them fall. He'd been through too much to break now. He'd survived the rogues, survived the pain, survived the fear. He could survive this too. My brother, he finally said. He's still dying. I failed him. Something shifted in Darian's expression. What if you didn't have to? What do you mean? Darian seemed to be wrestling with something internally, his jaw tightening and releasing as he considered his words. The night market was real, but it doesn't exist anymore. I shut it down 50 years ago because too many humans were being exploited. However, he paused. I am the Alpha King. My blood has already healed you. It could heal your brother too. Hope, dangerous and painful, flared in Kale's chest. He had seen what Darian's blood could do. His injuries, which should have taken weeks to heal, had vanished overnight. If that same power could save Finn, you would do that? He asked, hating the desperate edge in his voice. I have conditions. Of course he did. Kale steeled himself. What do you want? Stay here. Give the bond time to settle. 3 months. If at the end of that time you still want to leave, we'll find a way to break it. It's possible, though difficult and painful, but I won't keep you prisoner. He met Kale's eyes. In exchange, I'll send my personal physician to your brother with enough of my blood to cure him completely. Why? Kale demanded. Why offer this? What do you really want from me? Darian's laugh was harsh, edged with self-loathing. Honestly, I don't know. The bond is clouding my judgment. Every instinct I have is screaming at me to keep you here, to protect you, to never let you out of my sight. But I've spent over 200 years as a king, not a slave to emotion. So I'm trying to find a middle ground. One where your brother lives, you have a choice, and I don't lose my mind. It was, Kale had to admit, more than fair. More than he'd expected from the Alpha King who'd ordered him dragged before his throne. The alternative was to refuse, leave immediately, and doom both his brother and potentially himself. He had no illusions about his ability to survive the Shadowlands alone, especially without the bond. 3 months, he said slowly. And you'll heal my brother now? Not at the end. I'll send someone tonight. You have my word. The word of an Alpha King. The word of your mate, Darian corrected. Which, whether you believe it or not, means something. Kale studied Darian's face, looking for deception. But all he saw was exhaustion that matched his own and a frustration that seemed genuine. He didn't want this any more than Kale did. That, at least, was some comfort. Fine, Kale said. 3 months. But I want your promise in blood, since that seems to matter to your kind. At the end of 3 months, if I choose to leave, you'll help me break the bond and let me go. No tricks. No conditions. Darian extended his hand. Agreed. A blood oath. Kale hesitated, then placed his hand in Darian's. His skin was cold, but the moment they touched, that warmth in Kale's chest bloomed into something almost pleasant. He could feel the bond pulsing between them, responding to their proximity. He tried to ignore it. Darian produced a small knife from somewhere and cut across his palm, dark blood welling up. Then he offered the blade to Kale. Kale did the same, wincing at the sting of the sharp edge against his flesh. Darian pressed their bleeding hands together, and power surged through the contact. Kale could feel it, electric and binding, settling into his bones like a second heartbeat. I, Darian Voss, Alpha King of the Shadowlands, swear on my blood that I will send aid to heal your brother, and that in 3 months' time, should you wish to leave, I will help you break our bond and release you freely. The words seemed to hang in the air, glowing with supernatural weight. Kale felt them settle into his bones, knew somehow that Darian couldn't break this promise even if he wanted to. The blood oath was absolute, binding both of them to its terms. I, Kale Whitmore, swear on my blood to stay here for 3 months and give this bond a fair chance. The oath completed, and the glowing faded. Darian released his hand, and Kale saw that the cut on his palm was already healing, the skin knitting itself back together. His blood still worked in Kale's system. I'll make the arrangements for your brother tonight, Darian said, standing. Captain Merrick will take your information. Where he is, who cares for him? My physician will be discreet. Thank you, Kale said, the words tasting strange. He was thanking the Alpha King who terrified him just hours ago. Nothing made sense anymore. Darian moved toward the door, then paused. Kale, those rogues who hurt you, they'll burn in the sunrise tomorrow. I wanted you to know. Good, Kale said, and meant it. Darian nodded, something like approval in his eyes, and left him alone. Kale sat in the massive bed, surrounded by silk and shadows, and wondered what he'd just agreed to. 3 months with the Alpha King. 3 months to explore this bond that he didn't want but couldn't deny. He touched his chest where the warmth still glowed and tried not to think about how right it had felt to hold Darian's hand. 6 weeks passed like a strange dream. Kale had his own chambers now, smaller than Darian's, but still more luxurious than anywhere he'd ever lived. He had servants who attended to his needs, clothes and fabrics he couldn't name, and freedom to roam most of the castle. The one place he couldn't go was beyond the castle walls. The Shadowlands are dangerous for humans, Darian had explained the first time Kale had asked. Even with my blood in your system, you're still vulnerable. And every vampire for miles can sense our bond. Some would respect it, others wouldn't. Kale had also received confirmation that his brother, Finn, had been healed. Captain Merrick had delivered the message himself, his scarred face uncharacteristically gentle. The physician had administered Darian's blood, and within hours, Finn's color had returned, his strength restored. He was asking for Kale, wondering where his brother had gone. Kale had sent a letter back, saying only that he was safe and would return soon. The lie tasted bitter, but what else could he say? I'm the fated Omega of the Alpha King and bound to him by blood magic. Finn would think he'd lost his mind. Life in the castle fell into an unexpected rhythm. Darian was often busy with the duties of ruling, settling disputes between vampire houses, managing the complex politics of the immortal world, dealing with threats that Kale didn't fully understand. But every evening, without fail, Darian came to find him. Sometimes they had dinner together, though Darian didn't eat. He sat with Kale, drinking wine that Kale suspected had more than grapes in it, asking about his day. Other times they walked the castle gardens, beautiful even in eternal night, filled with flowers that bloomed only in darkness, their petals glowing with soft bioluminescence. They talked. That was the strangest part. Kale had expected a monster, a creature of pure cruelty and hunger. But Darian was more. He was sharp and cynical with a dark humor that surprised laughs out of Kale. He knew poetry and history, could speak a dozen languages, and had seen empires rise and fall over his long existence. And he listened. When Kale talked about his childhood, about growing up poor with a sick brother and absent parents, about the fear and love that had driven him to the Shadowlands, Darien listened with an intensity that made Kale feel like he was the only person in his world. And slowly, despite everything, Kale began to see the man beneath the monster. They were in the castle library one evening, a massive room filled with books from every age, scrolls in dead languages, knowledge accumulated over millennia. It had become Kale's favorite place, and Darien had taken to joining him there. The fire crackled in the massive hearth, casting dancing shadows across the walls. "You're distracted tonight." Darien's voice pulled Kale from his thoughts. "Sorry," Kale said, closing the book he'd been staring at without reading. "Just thinking." Darien sat across from him, elegant even in the simple chair. "About how strange this all is. 6 weeks ago, I wanted to die. Now I'm sitting in a vampire castle reading ancient texts, having civil conversations with said vampire." He looked up at Darien. "How does that happen?" "Adaptation," Darien said. "Humans are remarkably good at it. It's why you've survived as a species despite being so fragile." "Thanks for the reminder." Darien smiled. A real smile, not the cold expression he wore in court. The sight of it made Kale's heart do an unwelcome flip. He was in trouble, and he knew it. The bond was working, weaving its magic around his heart whether he wanted it to or not. "Can I ask you something?" Kale said. "Always. Why haven't you?" Kale hesitated, searching for words. "The bond. You said it could be completed if I was turned. Why haven't you pushed for that? Most of the books I've read say alpha vampires are possessive of their omegas to the point of madness." Darien's expression grew serious, the playfulness fading from his eyes. "They are. I am. Do you know how many times a day I think about it? Turning you. Making you immortal. Ensuring you can never leave me." He leaned forward, his crimson eyes intense. "Constantly, Kale. It's a hunger worse than bloodthirst. Every moment you're not in my sight, I have to physically restrain myself from finding you. Every time I catch your scent, my control nearly shatters." "Then why don't you?" "Because you deserve a choice." Darien's voice was raw with feeling. "You came here with no agency, no control over your fate. I won't take what little freedom you have left. If you're ever turned, it will be because you choose it, not because I forced it on you." The words hit Kale harder than he expected. All his life, people had made choices for him. His parents abandoning him and Finn. The village elders deciding they weren't worth helping. Even his own choice to sacrifice himself had been born from desperation, not true freedom. Darien was offering him something no one else ever had. Real choice. "What if I never choose it?" Kale asked quietly. "What if at the end of 3 months, I still want to leave?" Pain flickered across Darien's face. Gone so quickly Kale almost missed it. "Then I'll honor my oath. I'll help you break the bond, and I'll let you go. It will hurt you. Yes. Maybe kill you. Possibly." He shrugged, affecting nonchalance. But Kale could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his hands had tightened into fists. "I've lived over 200 years. If this is what ends me, so be it." Kale stood abruptly, frustrated with Darien, with himself, with this whole impossible situation. "Don't say that. Don't act like your life doesn't matter. Doesn't it?" Darien rose as well, moving toward Kale with that predatory grace. "I'm a monster, Kale. I've killed thousands, not to survive, but because I could. Because humans were nothing to me but food and entertainment. I've raised villages, broken families, inspired so much fear that parents still tell their children stories about me to make them behave." He stopped in front of Kale, close enough that Kale had to tilt his head back to meet his eyes. Close enough to feel the cold radiating from his body, to smell his scent, smoke and embers, ancient and powerful. "Why should I live when so many died by my hand?" "Because people can change," Kale said. "Because the man who did those things isn't the same one standing in front of me. Because—" He stopped, the words catching in his throat. "Because what?" "Because I don't want you to die," Kale whispered. And I don't know when that became true. But it is. The air between them electrified. Darian's eyes widened, and for a moment, he looked almost human. Vulnerable. The mask of the Alpha King had slipped, revealing the man beneath. Kale. Darian breathed his name like a prayer, like something sacred. Tell me to stop. Tell me you don't feel this. Kale should. He should step back, reinforce the walls he'd been carefully building. But 6 weeks of conversation and careful courtesy had worn down his defenses. 6 weeks of seeing Darian be gentle with servants, fair in judgments, passionate about protecting his people, even the monstrous ones. 6 weeks of falling without meaning to. I can't, Kale admitted. I do feel it. I hate that I do. But I can't lie about it anymore. Darian raised his hand slowly, giving Kale every chance to pull away, and cupped his face gently. His touch was cold, but the bond sang at the contact, warmth flooding through Kale. His thumb brushed across Kale's cheek, tracing the place where a bruise had been. I don't deserve you, Darian said, his voice rough. This bond tied you to a monster. Then be better than a monster, Kale said. Not for the bond. For yourself. Something in Darian seemed to break, or maybe heal. He leaned down slowly, giving Kale time to refuse. When Kale didn't, when he actually rose on his toes to meet Darian halfway, Darian kissed him. It was gentle, reverent. Nothing like the violence Kale had expected from an Alpha King. Darian's lips were cool against his, but the bond flared hot, singing in Kale's veins. Kale's hands came up to grip Darian's shirt, pulling him closer, and Darian made a sound low in his throat that was almost vulnerable, a small, broken noise that spoke of centuries of loneliness. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard. Well, Kale was breathing hard. Darian was just affected. Kale felt the bond settle into place with an almost audible click. This was the second stage, he realized. Emotional acceptance. The bond was no longer just a physical recognition. It had become something deeper, something that resonated in his very soul. So, Darian said, his voice rougher than usual. Does this mean you're staying? Kale laughed despite himself. I have 6 more weeks on our agreement. That wasn't an answer. Kale pulled back enough to look at Darian properly. I don't know yet. This is all still so much. So fast. He touched his chest where the bond glowed warm. But I'm willing to see where it goes. I'll take it, Darian said, and kissed him again. The next weeks were different. There was still uncertainty, still fear of the future. But there was also joy. Darian smiled more, laughed at Kale's terrible jokes, showed him parts of the castle that even his court didn't know about. Secret passages hidden behind tapestries, hidden gardens where moonlight flowers bloomed, a room at the top of the highest tower where you could see stars that had been forgotten by the rest of the world. He told Kale about his human life, the family he'd lost to plague when he was barely 19, the grief that had nearly destroyed him. He told him about the vampire who'd turned him, a cruel alpha who'd seen a young man in mourning and decided to make him a monster out of boredom. He told Kale about the years of madness that followed, the slow climb back to sanity, the decision to build a kingdom rather than just destroy. Kale told Darian about Finn, about the fear of watching his brother waste away, about the guilt of leaving him to come here. He talked about his parents, who had abandoned them when Finn was just a baby, leaving Kale to raise his brother alone. He talked about the villagers who had looked down on them, who had refused to help when Finn got sick because Omegas weren't worth saving. Darian sent regular updates through Captain Merrick. Finn was thriving, attending school again, living the life Kale had always wanted for him. You saved him, Darian said one night as they stood in the star room, the sky stretching endlessly above them. That takes remarkable courage. Or remarkable desperation, Kale countered. Courage and desperation often look the same. Darian pulled him against his side, and Kale went willingly, tucking himself under Darian's arm. The position felt natural now, comfortable in a way that still surprised him. He'd never been comfortable with anyone before, had never had someone he could lean on without fear of being hurt. Kale, Darian said finally. The 3 months are up tomorrow. Kale's heart clenched. He'd been trying not to think about it, trying to live in the moment. But the deadline had been approaching, and now it was here. 3 months since he'd stumbled into the Shadowlands. Broken and bleeding, wanting nothing but death. I know, he said quietly. And? Kale turned to face him, taking both his hands in his. Darian's hands were cold, but Kale had grown used to it. He'd grown used to a lot of things about Darian. I'm terrified, he admitted. This bond, this life, it's not what I planned. I was supposed to die saving Finn, not fall in love with an alpha king. Love? Darian's eyes widened. Oh, don't look so surprised. You had to know. Knowing and hearing are different things. Darian squeezed his hands, his grip gentle despite his strength. Kale, I love you too. I think I have since that first moment when you looked at me with those frost blue eyes and showed no fear. You've made me want to be better, to be worthy of you. You already are, Kale said. You've kept every promise, given me every freedom you could. You've treated me as an equal when you could have just commanded. So you'll stay? Kale took a deep breath. I'll stay, but I have conditions. Darian smiled, the expression soft and warm in a way that would have shocked his court. Of course you do. I want to see Finn. I want him to know I'm alive and safe. I don't have to tell him everything, but I can't let him think I abandoned him. Done. I'll arrange safe passage for him to visit. And I want to do something useful. I can't just be your mate sitting in a castle. I need purpose. I could use an advisor, Darian said thoughtfully. Someone who understands the Omega perspective, who can help me rebuild bridges between our peoples. The position would be official, with real power. You could be the first Omega to hold such a position in the Shadowlands. Kale nodded. I can do that. And anything else? Kale hesitated, then said, Eventually, I want to be turned. Not now, I'm not ready. But someday, I want forever with you. I want to stop being fragile. I want to be your true equal. Can you wait for that? Darian pulled him into a fierce embrace, his arms wrapping around Kale like he never intended to let go. I would wait centuries for you, Kale Whitmore. Eternity seemed short by comparison. They stood in the starlight, holding each other, and Kale felt the bond settle completely. No longer a trap or a burden, but a choice he was making with open eyes. I love you, he whispered against Darian's chest. I love you, Darian whispered back. My brave, impossible, perfect mate. 2 years later, Kale walked through the halls of Shadowmere Keep with confidence now, nodding to servants and courtiers who'd long since accepted him as their future king consort. In his arms, he carried scrolls, plans for the new peace treaty between the vampire kingdoms and human territories, a project he'd been spearheading for months. So much had changed. Finn lived in the castle now too, having chosen to work as an apprentice to Darian's physician. He was happy, healthy, and had even developed a cautious friendship with Captain Merrick, much to Kale's amusement. The two of them could often be found in the training yards, Merrick teaching Finn how to defend himself. The rogues who'd hurt Kale were long dead, burned to ash in the sunrise. But their deaths had sparked something in Darian, a campaign to hunt down other rogues, to make the Shadowlands safer for everyone. He'd become known not just as a fearsome king, but a just one. The people of the Shadowlands had begun to trust him, to see him as a protector rather than a tyrant. And Kale had found his purpose. He negotiated treaties, advised on Omega matters, and slowly helped reshape vampire society into something less monstrous. It was hard work, often frustrating, but deeply fulfilling. He was making a difference, not just for himself, but for others like him. He found Darian in their shared chambers. They'd stopped pretending to sleep separately after about month 4, reading reports by candlelight. Darian looked up when he entered, and his whole face softened in that way that still made Kale's heart skip a beat. How was the council meeting? Darian asked. Productive. Lord Vance is still a pompous ass, but even he had to agree the new trade routes make sense. Kale set down his scrolls and crossed to Darian. How was your day? Long, tedious. Better now that you're here. Darien pulled him into his lap, and Kale went willingly, curling against him. He'd never been a cuddler before, had never wanted to be touched. But with Darien, it felt right. Natural. Like coming home. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment before Kale said, "I've been thinking." "Dangerous." Kale swatted his arm. "I'm ready." Darien stilled. "Ready for?" "To be turned. To complete the bond fully. To have forever with you." Kale met his eyes. "I'm ready, Darien." He saw the war in Darien's expression, joy and fear, desire and restraint. "Are you sure?" "There's no going back." "I'm sure. I've had 2 years to think about it. I've seen what your world is really like, not just the pretty parts. I've made my peace with it." Kale cupped Darien's face, his thumb tracing the sharp line of his jaw. "I choose you. I choose this. I choose forever." Darien kissed him then, deep and desperate, pouring 2 years of love and longing into the gesture. When he pulled back, his eyes had shifted to that ancient crimson that marked his true nature, his fangs lengthening slightly. "It will hurt," he warned. "I know. You'll die and be reborn. I know. You'll be bound to me for all eternity." "Darien," Kale said gently, "I already am. This just makes it official." Darien laughed, the sound almost broken. "How did I ever deserve you?" "You didn't. But you chose to become someone who could." Kale tilted his head, exposing his throat, a gesture of trust among vampires, and one he'd never made with anyone else. "I'm ready when you are." Darien pressed a gentle kiss to his throat, his lips lingering over the pulse point. "I love you, Kale. In this life, and every one after." "I love you too," Kale whispered. "Now and forever." When Darien's fangs pierced his skin, there was pain, sharp and burning, like fire racing through his veins. But there was also light, and love, and the bond between them singing its completion at last. Kale could feel Darien's power flowing into him, could feel his human body dying and being remade into something greater. He felt his human life drain away, and he wasn't afraid. He was choosing his future. He was choosing love. He was choosing Darien. And as darkness took him, ready to be reborn into immortality, Kale's last human thought was that sometimes the best things in life came from the worst circumstances. He'd come to the Shadowlands to die, and instead, he'd learned how to truly live. 2 months later, Kale opened his eyes as a newborn vampire. The transition had been brutal. He wouldn't pretend otherwise. The fever, the pain, the hunger that gnawed at his insides like a living thing. But Darien had been there through all of it, never leaving his side, holding him through the worst of it. And now he was here, immortal, powerful, bound to his alpha in ways that transcended anything he could have imagined. He sat up in the bed, testing his new body. Everything felt sharper, clearer. He could hear the heartbeat of the servants in the next room, could smell the blood in their veins. The urge to hunt was there, but it was manageable. Darien had taught him control, taught him how to master the hunger rather than let it master him. "You're awake." Darien's voice came from the doorway, and Kale looked up to find his alpha leaning against the frame, watching him with an expression of pure love. "Alpha," Kale said, and the word felt right in ways it never had before. He held out his hand, and Darien crossed the room in an instant, taking it in his own. "How do you feel?" Darien asked, sitting on the edge of the bed. "Amazing. Powerful. Hungry." Kale smiled. "But mostly just complete. The bond feels right now. Full." "That's because it is." Darien lifted his hand and pressed a kiss to his palm. "Welcome to your eternal life, my love." "I never thought I'd have this," Kale admitted. "A future. A purpose. Someone who loves me." "You'll always have it," Darien promised. "For as long as we exist, I will love you." Kale leaned in and kissed him, tasting the familiar coolness of his lips. When they pulled apart, he pressed his forehead against Darien's. "I love you too," he said. "Always." And it was true. For the first time in his life, Kale had everything he'd ever wanted. A mate who cherished him. A purpose that mattered. a future that stretched out before him like an endless, beautiful road. He'd come to the Shadowlands to die. Instead, he'd found a love that would last forever.